but it is also, North Korea is just 150 years ago, is home to one of the planet's greatest revivals that ever occurred. So if you track back with me through history to 1866, in 1866, the Korea was not North and South as we know it now; it was just a single kingdom, and there was a man by the name of Robert Jermaine Thomas. Now, some of you have heard, I believe it was Pastor Craig when he was here back in March, or in fact, I think it was February 2020. He used Robert Jermaine Thomas as a part of his sermon illustration. But Robert Jermaine Thomas was a Welshman. He was a Protestant, and he went to China in order to be a missionary with his wife. His wife died just after about 4 months of being there, as she had a horrible miscarriage with their child, and so his unborn child and wife died, which terribly affected him. He was unsure whether God was calling him to missions or not, but he stayed in China to await God's clarity. And in time, he became impassioned with the idea of taking the gospel to the Korean people. It was a closed kingdom. They didn't want any outside Western influence, especially from Christianity. And so whatever happened was going to be a very covert mission. And so he found a way to get in with the Americans. He himself was Welsh and he was working in a customs office in China, but he found a way to learn Korean and become an interpreter for the American traders that were going into Korea. And so in 1866, Robert Jermaine Thomas was aboard the General Sherman, which was a vessel, an American vessel going into Korea to try and make trade, to try and open up some kind of trade between America and Korea, because they were totally closed off to anything like that. Now, uh, to be honest, Robert Jermaine Thomas' effort was entirely just to be on that boat so that he could get Chinese Bibles into the Korean country. But that was the only reason he was really there. The whole interpreter thing was pretty much just a cover for him. But he was there, and he had literally tons of Chinese Bibles on the boat in the vessel as they were going into these uncharted, uh, uh, unwelcoming, tricky waters into Korea, going up the river that would lead them to the capital. And as they were going, Robert Jermaine Thomas was distributing as many of the Bibles as he could at every port that they stopped into. And so he had so many Koreans coming on board to hear this Westerner preach to them in almost perfect fluent Korean. They were receiving Chinese Bibles, which they were mostly able to read. And at one point, it actually says that he had so many Koreans on the boat listening to him preach that the boat almost capsized. So he had a large audience. God was really blessing his missionary work. And he was handing out Bibles all the way that he was going. But tensions were rising between the Korean officials and the Sherman, the boat that they were on, because the Americans were not welcome in Korea, and they were not doing their best to try and keep tensions at bay. They were being quite arrogant, quite rude to the Korean principals, especially as they were coming closer to the capital of Korea, which was Pyongyang. A lot of tensions were rising, to the point that when the Sherman came into the capital city of Pyongyang on the river, there was failed communication, and the Americans started making threats against the Koreans, and actually started firing their cannonballs at the civilians on the shore, much against Robert Jermaine Thomas's pleas. He was trying to keep it peaceful, but they weren't listening to him. And so that then the Sherman, not knowing the Korean waters it was in, actually run aground on a mud bank, and the Koreans very cleverly lit small boats on fire and sent them down the river. And so they ran into the General Sherman vessel, and it started to explode in flames. So that Robert Jermaine Thomas, this missionary who was only 27 years old, started throwing as many Bibles overboard as he could, and landing some of them on the embankment. And he himself jumped into the water and swam to the shore with 3 Bibles. And he was taken. He was arrested as soon as he got to the shore. A man by the name of Chun Kwon Park. If there's any Koreans in our midst tonight, they'll tell you I'm mispronouncing it, but That's okay. Chun Kwon Park was a Korean official who arrested Robert Jermaine Thomas and brought him to the general, to the governor of the on the River Shore, and as he was about to be killed and he knew his time was up, he pleaded with the man to take the Bible. He gave the man a Bible as the sword came down and chopped off his head. And Korea drank the blood of the very first martyr there in the capital city of Pyongyang. He died at just 27 years of age. The Korean Authority, however, they did whatever they could to strip everybody. And anybody who had gotten one of these Chinese Bibles, they were taking the Bibles off of them, they were burning them, they were throwing them away. But there were some people, including a young child, who was able to keep some Bibles and hide them and keep them for themselves in the future years. So that's 1866, the first Protestant martyr in Korea, in Pyongyang, in 1866. Fast forward 30 years about, in the 1890s, now you've got an American missionary trying to get into Korea, and it's a lot more open now because trades are opening up. 30 years is a lot of progress. So now you've got Reverend Moffat. Reverend Moffat is an American missionary. He's gone to Korea. And in his travels around the Pyongyang mountains and rivers, as he's trying to share Christ and not get himself killed, he comes across a man who is about in his 40s, who actually knew the story of Jesus and knew much of the gospel content. He wasn't a Christian yet, but he knew about Jesus, he knew about the Bible, he knew about the Apostle Paul. It was a very strange situation for this American missionary to find in this hut on the riverbank. And so he found him, and this young man, his name was Cho Chi Rang. And he actually told Moffat that he had quite an interesting story. Because when he was just 11 years old, 30 years beforehand, he and his uncle had gone down to the Taedong River in Pyongyang because they had heard that an American ship was coming in through the river. And so he and his uncle went down and they watched as this fight broke out, and a Westerner swam to shore throwing Bibles and was executed. This young man, let me get it right, Cho Chi Ring, had witnessed the death of Robert Jermaine Thomas and had that day been one of the men that had kept a Bible for himself. And he took back the Bible to his own house and since then had been studying it. And at that moment, Reverend Moffat was able to bring this man, Cho Chi Ring, to faith because he had already been so prepared by the reading of the scriptures over so long. And so this young man got the Bible and then was saved 30 years later in 1890 at the hands of Reverend Moffat. There was another man back in 1866 who had also kept a Bible, but this man was a Korean official. He was a Korean official who had overseen many of the killings of the Westerners, and he himself also kept a Bible, not because he cared about the content, but because he really liked the nice, flaky, golden-lined pages of the Bible. And so he ripped it all up very carefully, sliced all the pages out, and he actually wallpapered his hut, his government-built hut, in Bible pages because he thought it looked nice, beautiful Chinese characters. He just liked the specialty of it. But over the years, many Koreans had started to come into that hut to read this mystical, wonderful, foreign story that they could find on this man's walls. And so hundreds of Koreans had been prepared for the message of Jesus over this 30-year period because in the governor's house, there was Bible plastered to the walls. And it was in fact Cho Chi Ring, who as he's talking that day in 1890, he's talking with Reverend Moffat and he tells him that day, newly converted, like just converted in that moment. And he tells him, I saved up money and I purchased the hut that Pak Yong-sik, the Korean official, had plastered with the Bible, and I purchased it and I've recently moved into it. In fact, that is the building that we are sitting in right now. And Reverend Moffat looked around with his little lantern and he realized that 30 years old Bible passages have just been plastered to the house that he is in. It's an amazing story of God's magnificent providence. When He wants the Bible and the story of the gospel to get into a people, He is able to do it no matter the opposition. It is one of the most inspiring stories that at the moment, Robert Jermaine Thomas has never heard, but he will hear in the days of glory when we can recount it to him.